Hello and welcome to the Memory Capsule Podcast, where we interview members of the Pokemon TCG community. My name is Rafal Gladys. Each week, we'll be speaking with our guests about their background with Pokemon TCG, how they got involved with the game, and give them an opportunity to share their love of the game. Today's guest is Cyrus Davis. Cyrus is an incredibly talented player who is perhaps best known for winning NAIC 2023 with Urshifu Inteleon. They also have several other incredible achievements, including a regional top 16 and a top 4, as well as a ninth place finish at the 2023 World Championships. Cyrus is also known for playing several unorthodox deck archetypes to great success, and has written several high quality guides and articles for the Shuffle Squad, Metafy, and Schemanske's Corner. How are you doing, Cyrus?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Is there anything I might have missed with your introduction that I might have forgotten or not noticed?
I don't think so. Most important thing, just for anyone commenting, I do use she, they pronouns. Um, but yeah, I'm definitely most known for winning the North American International Championships in 2023 and immediately following it up with a ninth place at Worlds. I've been playing for quite a long time. I taught myself how to play back in about 2012-ish, so coming on about 12 years now.
Not bad. That's about when I got into the game as well. So we might have some similar experiences getting into the game. Um, I'm gonna maybe just get started with I asking you the kind of the same question I ask every guest at the start, which is just what is your favorite card of all time and why?
So art wise, my favorite card is Espeon from Neo Revelations. Just a beautiful card. And Espeon is my favorite Pokemon. But card wise, I think it has to be either Evitelli X or Gardevoir GX. I can't quite decide between the two, but Evitelli X was a deck that I played basically from the time that almost from the time that it released to the time that it rotated. So it's a card that I was just always in love with. And then Gardevoir GX was the deck that I played for my first full season, like competing at cups and challenges and stuff like that. So
Gotcha. Is there other than kind of just playing those cards a lot, is there a specific reason those they stand out to you? Did you like the effects, the decks they kind of work with? Why do they stand out to you so much?
I think Gardevoir GX, Gardevoir has always been one of my favorite Pokemon, but it also the attack being so similar to Evitelli X's, which was the deck that I started with. So Evitel definitely special place in my heart because it was my first like actual competitive deck. So both cards primarily carried by like nostalgia, but Gardevoir GX I think I connected with a lot just because of how similar it was to Evitelli X in just what the attack did. Um, and even like going back and playing those formats is just one of the most fun decks that I've played. It both decks require like um quite a bit of strategic thinking. They're not decks that you can just turn off your brain and play. So um both decks had a very pivotal part in my progression as a player in my early days of playing Pokemon.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense, and maybe that can kind of yeah perfectly transition us to my next question, which is how did you get involved with the Pokemon TCG?
So I was sort of always into Pokemon as a franchise because my older brother was into it before I was born. Um, he stopped playing like he never played the TCG and stopped dealing with Pokemon when I was probably about 10 or 11 years old. But I ended up teaching myself to play Pokemon from the rulebook when I was about 10 years old. Um, and it's just been a huge part of my life ever since. Um, I actually played a little bit of like Yu-Gi-Oh very casually before that. I was a kid, so I was just like playing with my friends and stuff like that with, probably probably banned cards and just terrible decks. But I tried to go to a Yu-Gi-Oh locals in my city, and they told me that they didn't let, they told my dad that they didn't let any kids under 12 play, and that was actually why I taught myself how to play Pokemon originally. So I was like, okay, well they won't let me play Yu-Gi-Oh at in this city, so I guess I'll teach myself how to play Pokemon because I love Pokemon. And then I started going to my local league pretty shortly after that.
Gotcha. That's interesting. I mean, I guess in another timeline, you're a YCS champion instead of a NAIC
Yeah.
champion, right? What was then like your first competitive event? Because playing at League and just learning how to play the game is one thing. At what point did you start to take the game a bit seriously, build competitive decks, and get involved with playing competitively?
Yeah, so it wasn't until 2014 that I actually got into playing competitive decks. So I wasn't really allowed to buy cards. I would get like cards like in packs for my birthday or Christmas from time to time when I was a kid, and that's sort of what I had built my decks out of up to that point. They're basically just like theme decks plus a couple of EXs that I had pulled here and there. I remember I know that I played to a Canadian Nationals at some point. A like deck with white Kyurem EX, black Kyurem EX, Kyurem, Reshiram, and Zekrom, and my only trainers were 4 Silent, which just lets you search your deck for 3 energy, because I was like, oh, well, I play Lightning, Water, and Fire. This trainer card's broken. I have 4 of them. I'm going to put all 4 in my deck, and I can search for a Water, Fire, and Lightning. Um, but it wasn't until 2014 that a friend of mine actually stole um one of the decks that I had built from my own collection. And um so my dad was like, okay, because he felt so bad, he let me buy a couple of singles for Yveltal Darkrai. I just sort of looked up competitive Pokemon decks, and that was the first deck I found. He bought me a couple singles, and I was able to trade for the rest with kids at my school over the course of a couple of months. Um, and that was my first competitive deck. I took it to Canadian Nationals in 2014. I don't know how that actually went, because at that point I had started watching competitive YouTube videos and stuff like that. I started to have an idea of what how Pokemon was actually played, but I still didn't really know anything about standings or how to read them or what championship points were. And my parents weren't really involved in trying to help me figure that out, other than taking me to an event like 2 or 3 times a year. So that was my first competitive event. Um, but it wasn't until actually like 2017 when my parents started letting me drive to like league cups and stuff like that with my friend Dennis Paroff, that I was actually able to start, competing and understanding the system and championship points and stuff like that.
Gotcha. And maybe just like for some context, like when did you then get into like the Masters division? Were you still playing in seniors around that 2017 time period, or had you already kind of entered the Masters division and was getting involved with the main events and stuff?
So that would have been my first year of Masters, was the 2017 to 2018 season.
Okay.
And um I before that I'd only gone to maybe 3 premier events, like official events per season. Just I was only allowed to go about an hour away from home. And then yeah, that was my first year of Masters, was when I actually started playing locals and stuff. And that year I still only played 1 major event, just the local Toronto regionals. But I was able to, play a little bit more locally.
Gotcha. What was like kind of your local community like? I know Toronto now is known as one of the most competitive areas. Is that what allowed you to grow as a player, kind of growing up in a competitive area for the game?
Yeah, so my friend Dennis Paroff, I mentioned earlier, he was really the only competitive player in the city that I lived in. So I live in St. Catharines, which is about a 2-hour drive from Toronto. Um, and he was the only player that I had ever met in St. Catharines, up to that point at least, that had any idea other than me of like what the competitive decks looked like and stuff like that. So Dennis kind of taught me everything that I knew about the game. Um, Even for locals, I was still not allowed to travel far out of my city, but I would get to play, my when my local store did host like the occasional like city championship, I would be able to play against, like players like Raymond Long and Michael Long, who obviously built up a legacy for themselves as of now. So I do think that that was like a huge part of my growth, just being around such strong players. I mean, Dennis finally got his first regional top cut this season. He came second in Vancouver. Um, and then my first season of Masters, although it was still fairly casual, that was when I started getting to play against all of the great Ontario players like Zach and Kieran, and there's far too many to mention. So those are the only 2 I will, so that I don't forget anybody. But um, yeah, that was when I started getting to compete with like the cream of the crop Ontario Master Division players, and I do think it very much accelerated my growth in the game.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to think about kind of that time period, like 17, 18, because we were still sort of transitioning into the era we have now where information is very easily accessible, but we were kind of out of that time period where everyone was quite as secretive with their lists. You had to kind of go through internet forums and stuff. What were you doing to improve as a player? Did you kind of build up a testing group? Were you trying to play online or anything like that?
Honestly, at that point, I still was playing pretty casually. Um, I was happy to just keep playing Gardevoir GX to every tournament and just trying every single time a new set came out. I would just go through the set list and be like, what cards in here are good in Gardevoir GX? Those are the cards I need to pick up from the new set. Like, what cards do I need to have in the binder in case I want to play them? Um, Me and Dennis were like primarily each other's only testing partners for pretty much all the way up until like late 2018, early 2019 season. Um, so I was really content to just play Pokemon at the best ability I could. I would practice against myself a lot. I mean, that's still my primary method of practice is just playing against myself, and definitely did it a lot more back then.
Gotcha. So when I look at your limitless page, which is going to be kind of the main resource that I have accessible to me for like your finishes and stuff. The first big thing that comes out is this top four at Dallas Regionals in 2019. Am I right in thinking that that was your first day two, or am I mistaken with that?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, the 2017 to 18 season, I only attended one major event. That was my first event in the Master Division, Toronto Regionals, and then Dallas 2019 was my second ever event in the Masters Division, and that was my top four. This is the first event I've ever participated outside of Ontario as well.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Could you tell us a bit more about that event, how preparing for it went, and how did it feel to kind of go on a run like that at one of your first big events?
Yeah, so I really wasn't expecting much. I prepared a ton. I knew that I wanted to play Zero Garb, and I knew that it was like probably the best deck in the format. So I just focused on winning the mirror. I felt like I was pretty much favored into every single matchup except control. So I focused on testing a little bit control and then testing mirror, and making sure that my list was consistently favored against other lists that I've been seeing doing well. So I played a ton of games, especially with the help of my friend Nolan Randall. Um, and it was like something out of a dream from from like all of my seasons of not like I had never considered trying to go for an invite. I'd only been to one major event in Masters before that, and I got donked 5 times in my first 4 rounds and then dropped. Um, so it was a matter of just like I never expected to have that much success, at least that early in me trying to play competitively. I was only able to go to the event because my friend's dad convinced my parents to let me, go to my first out of Ontario event as long as I could pay for the trip myself. Um, and I just wanted to, do the best I could, prove that I thought that I was pretty decent in the game, but hadn't had any opportunities to show it, and I wanted to prove that I was, at least capable of what I thought I was, and I way over exceeded any of my expectations by making top fours. So
Could you tell us maybe a bit more about that run? Because this was actually an event for those who don't know, this was actually an expanded event. So what went into preparing for an event that was in a different format than most events were being played at the time, and kind of the general run of playing through an expanded event?
yeah, so I think that there's like a big difference in playing in an expanded event versus a standard event is knowledge of the card pool. So I mean, although I hadn't been playing super competitively, I had been playing for many years at that point. And so I had a knowledge of pretty much every card in the expanded card pool at the time. And I do think that like is a huge differentiator in some players, and their ability to prepare for expanded events. Like I don't have to do as much um I don't have to do as much new research when preparing for an expanded event versus a standard one, as someone who has been playing for a long time and is familiar with all of the cards in the format and how the decks work. Um, but I really just we had like quite a few expanded league cups and challenges at the time in the area. So I picked my deck and just started bringing it to all of my expanded locals, and preparing that way. Luckily, at that time, yeah, we did still have quite a few locals in the area that were running expanded. Um, so I was able to pretty easily get like a good amount of testing in against the very competitive Ontario Canada scene. So
Is expanded a format that you've looked at all into? I know a little bit of hype has come back to it because Stefan's been sharing some information and some results from Japan are kind of trickling out. Is that something you've been interested at all the last few years, or not really, since it's not been official in North America?
yeah, I don't play a ton of expanded or like GLC for that matter. Just like you said, because they aren't officially supported formats at the moment. But I do keep up with expanded. Like I look at all the results. I love looking at all Stefan's posts about it. I like looking at what's doing well when there are the occasional like expanded tournaments on Play Limitless. I definitely think I disagree with the majority of people about um, the state of expanded. I know a lot of people, especially the broader community, maybe has a bad taste in their mouth over expanded because when we do hear about expanded right now, it's always like a turn one win deck that goes viral on Twitter because it's fun to watch someone win on the first turn, stuff like that. Um, but I think there's way more skill to expanded than people give credit for. Overall, I think that like because of how consistent expanded is, you have so much larger of a card pool. Every deck functions so much more consistently. It is my preferred format, or at least it was the entire time that we had expanded official events. I think that that consistency, although it can enable some broken combos at times, in most meta games there are not actually that many broken combos that are uncounterable. And deck building also ends up being a much larger skill because of how big the card pool is. It means that you pretty much can never expect every decent deck to have been discovered, right? There's always going to be ways to innovate in expanded, the way that there isn't always ways to innovate in standard.
For sure. And I do think that the fact that expanded is being played a lot less probably means there's a lot more unexplored territory.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think I really would love to see more. Even in Japan, I don't think they have an incredible amount of expanded events. Obviously, they have them. They have the occasional, but it would be super cool to see more expanded events, even unofficially. If there were like more play limitless expanded events, I would be happy to play in those as well. I think the format um, is way more interesting than people give it credit for.
Hmm. I think the main inhibitor right now is just that PTCGL doesn't have access to the whole
Yeah,
card pool, unfortunately.
yeah, it is unfortunate. So we would have to play on like TCG1,
Yeah, or like tabletop or something, right?
Twin Leaf eventually.
True. um, so after that Dallas top four, how did it feel to have a finish like that? See that kind of success? Did it affect the way you approached your season, approached yourself as a player when it comes to your confidence or anything like that?
Yeah, that was definitely a huge confidence booster for me. From that moment on, I was like, this is what I want to be doing. I want to be playing more Pokemon. I had proven to myself that that all I did need was the opportunity to attend events to do well. Because the opportunity to attend events is just something I had never really had before that. My parents were never very supportive of Pokemon at all. And winning money at the first event that they let me travel to was obviously for them, they were a lot more willing to let me go to more events at that point. I did end up trying to go for my invite that season, but Dallas Regionals was, I believe, in January, so about um, you know, I think it was like late quarter 2. Um, and I had not tried to go for my invite before that at all. And honestly, I just wasn't prepared for, I think, the amount of grind that it takes to earn an invite, especially in not like a smaller than a full less time than a full season. Um, I was 16 and the traveling to multiple events just wore on me really heavily. Um, and I think I missed by about like 52 points. It was the year that it was 550 points for an invite, with pretty low BFLs, I believe. And I just could not keep up the grind throughout the season. I think I ended up having I went to the Origin special event that year and NAIC, and it just needed points at either, but I missed points at both for the invite that year.
Hmm.
But overall, the event was a huge confidence booster. Sorry, I played against I tied against Daniel Altavilla in auto loss. I beat Ross Cawthon in day 2. I beat Jose Marrero in day 2. I beat Hale Olbernolty in day 2. So I was sort of on these were all players that I had only ever heard of at the time. Like Ross Cawthon was one of my heroes playing Pokemon, and I had just beat him in my first out of Ontario event. So that was really what launched me into competitive, and then after that season, I've gotten my invite every year since.
Nice. There we go. Just needed that little boost, right?
Yeah. I just started a little bit late that year, but ever since it's been smooth sailing.
So the year after that, you continued to have some results in the expanded format. You got day 2 with Waylord, another pretty interesting expanded deck, and then as we all know, things kind of shut down due to COVID. You did continue to have some online results during the Limitless Invitational qualifiers. Did you continue playing a lot when everything was shut down? Because I know some players took it as a chance to take a break, have a hiatus. Some players played different formats, or some players just played a lot more. Kind of what camp were you in when it comes to playing during the pandemic?
Yeah, so Pokemon actually, became kind of my sole focus during the pandemic because, of lockdown. I didn't have too much else to do. I Up until the establishment of the first Pokemon Online Global Championships, I was playing very actively. I was playing in, whatever online tournaments I could. I could only play 2 of the Limitless qualifiers, and I believe I day 2'd both of the ones that I played. But so I helped organize the first Pokemon Online Global Championships, and then after that, I really switched it up into just organizing and judging online events. So I organized the Atlas Championship Series, and then I ended up helping coordinate sponsorship for a bunch of other tournament series through Atlas Collectibles. So Atlas Collectibles was sponsoring about 15 different tournament series with store credit prizing at the time, and somewhere along that timeline, I ended up moving cities to work at Atlas Collectibles. That way, I could be there to deal with all the prizing stuff myself, instead of having a middleman at all. And yeah, I pretty much until COVID eased up and we were allowed to go do tournaments again, I was organizing and judging, and I started, judging my local league. So for the first half of the pandemic, I was playing a lot, and then I kept up with the format while I was judging, up until events came back.
Okay, makes sense. And then events come back, and suddenly you kind of have a bit of a breakout season. You have quite a few really strong finishes just straight out of the gate. How did you kind of prepare yourself for going into that post-pandemic season, where you attended a lot more events, a lot more international stuff, even going to LAIC? What went into preparing yourself for that kind of success and actually, being able to perform at that high of a level consistently?
I think it was mostly confidence. I had just played at my first World Championships before sort of that season where I had my breakout season. I played in the 2022 World Championships, and I went 5-3 in day 1. I lost my win into Lucas Calza, my win into day 2, and then I think I was just very confident going into the next season. I had just come off a season where I earned my invite, because I earned my invite for that World before the pandemic. I already had it by January that year, so I earned it in about a quarter, the first 2 quarters. And I was just sort of if I go to enough events this year, I was getting points at pretty much every event I had attended this season previous. So I was okay, if I just go to enough events, I'll get my invite. And I just sort of took it pretty casually. I practiced as much as I could, whenever I had the chance. And then I would sort of I think metagaming has always been one of my biggest strong suits. So I think I just made some very good meta calls for a lot of tournaments, and played my decks optimally, and I ended up having a 6 day streak in a row.
Hmm.
Um, and then I missed points. I bubbled points at 531 at Orlando and OCIC, which I had a stipend for. And after that, I felt like I was sort of out of the day two contention race. So I stopped attending events until I played Hartford and NAIC after that. Because I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to go for day two then. After missing points at OCIC in Orlando. And then, um, of course, and then NAIC happened.
Yeah, and we're gonna maybe kind of build up to that big NAIC finish. There's a couple things leading up to that I do want to ask you about.
Mhm.
It, at least as far as I can tell, it does kind of feel like your finishes are kind of a mix of playing kind of the best deck in the format at a very high level, interspersed with playing kind of very unorthodox decks. So you have finishes in Baltimore and Sao Paulo with Palkia, with Lugia, but then you also have Arceus Gudra. You have this Lost Zone box with Alolan Vulpix. What goes into preparing for events for you, especially when it comes to deciding on a more unusual or unorthodox deck archetype? I mean, I think you're probably the only person to day two with a Alolan Vulpix Lost Box. Like,
I
how
believe
did something
so.
like that come together?
So basically, my mentality for like most events, as someone who does like to play unorthodox decks, is I am looking for a deck that is favorable into like 90% of the meta. If I can, I'm spending most of my time preparing for an event trying to figure out what deck can be favorable into 90% into about 90% of the meta, and especially focusing on a deck that beats the most popular deck, especially in tier zero formats, like when Lugia V-Star was tier zero, or Zoro Garb, I'd say for Dallas that year was tier zero. And then, sort of as I close in on an event, if I'm like nothing beats the best deck in format, I think that if as an above average pilot of that deck, I can sort of beat any single matchup with the best deck in the format. That's when I just try to build the most consistent possible list for the best deck in the format. That way, I have an advantage in mirrors on consistency. So that is sort of like my process in choosing a deck for events, and why I do sometimes just land on the most popular deck in the format, with like a pretty consistent build. Deck like Lost Box Lolan Vulpix. So that was something that I cooked up the a couple days leading up to the to Toronto Regionals that year with Frank Persick, and our friend Joseph Cornell. So they were both staying with us, as well as Andre Chason, um, to drive up to Toronto Regionals in the morning. And the night before the event, we knew that we kind of had the idea that we wanted to play something with Alolan Vulpix to hard counter Lugia, um, and with Wash Energy, and then we knew that like ice, if we could also get Ice Q in there with Wash Energy, um, that also auto won a lot of decks like Lost Box and Lugia, or sorry, Lost Box and Reggie's. So that was sort of like our focus. Originally, I had played against an Alolan Vulpix V Star with Lugia deck at LAIC when I was playing Lugia, and I did beat it, but it felt very close, and I felt like I could maybe make a better list that would be more favored into the mirror. Um, and so that was where we started, and then we sort of realized that like the Lost Box engine made the most sense to play it with, because you had the combination of, in like a very easy way in Mirage Gate, to power up Alolan Vulpix and Ice Q. A very easy way to find your wash energies with the huge draw that the Lost Zone engine has. And then one of the problems for Alolan Vulpix and Ice Q is that a card like Escape Rope plus Boss's Orders can reset the effect of the attack. So Lost Box with Thornton and Goop Up Nets could pretty easily clear its whole bench, so that your only Pokemon in play was Ice Q, or your only Pokemon in play was Alolan Vulpix. And that was sort of the main strategy behind the deck. And then we included cards like Articuno and Snorlax, mostly to help us deal with um, like Stoutland and Lugia, sort of just beating us before we could get set up at all. Being able to paralyze the Stoutland, then knock it out with Snorlax was very effective. And then, of course, those two cards just came up in a lot of niche situations and against other matchups as well. Lugia V-Star was the tier 0 deck in that format, and then like Lost Box was sort of the main other deck. So we were pretty happy as long as we could take favorable maxes into both of those, since you could pretty much expect to hit like 6 Lugia in day one, or maybe like at least like 4 or 5. So we were pretty happy as long as we took a favorable match into that and Lost Box. We were like, okay, this deck can't be that bad.
Hmm. That makes sense, and it's interesting because I think a lot of players, especially at that Toronto regionals, when kind of post LAIC, everyone sees, oh, Lugia really is this like big bad scary tier zero deck. We have to counter it. A lot of players were moving towards that Articuno, towards Kyogre, towards Ice Cube, but your group was able to kind of put that all together, add the Vulpix, and create this just really interesting deck that was able to have success for you.
Yeah, I think the deck was a fairly strong call for the tournament. What we didn't expect was how many players would actually play outs to Articuno. So, like a lot of the Lugia that I played against, I think most of them played Birdkeeper as a way to switch out of Articuno, and nobody really played Birdkeeper that did well at LAIC. So we didn't expect, like, we knew that was an option, but we didn't expect that many people to pick up on like teching for Articuno, seeing as Articuno didn't really do anything super relevant at LAIC. And then there was also like the people that did well with the Lugia V-Star with Espeon VMAX, so that you're not affected by Articuno, that list. So I think that like into our expected meta, the deck was pretty strong. And then what did end up losing me some rounds in day two was that uh unpredicted number of counters to the Articuno. Um, that was really like the core of dealing with Stoutland against Lugia, and the fact that almost every Lugia player I played against in day two had an answer to it just did not work out for me. And then there was like a couple rounds, like there was one round against a Lost Box deck that had no answer to Ice Cube, where I just sort of got double donked, and so couldn't make a deeper run with the deck. But I do think it was a sometimes you make calls that are really good for day one and then just aren't as good for day two.
Hmm. I see. That's really interesting. So that can maybe then lead us to kind of this big back-to-back finish you had of first at NAIC and then ninth place at Worlds. You did kind of talk about your philosophy with planning for an event of trying to pick a deck that has positive matchups to as much of the field as possible. Is in that case, is Inteleon Urshifu a deck that stood out to you because of that for NAIC 2023? Because this was a format where Iono had just come out, Chen Pao had just come out. We were kind of getting some new archetypes. Gardevoir was really rising to the forefront. What led you to choose that deck as your choice for that event?
So yeah, I felt like there were quite a few players doing like pretty well with Inteleon in the events leading up to it. Not lists that I super liked, but there were players playing lists that I didn't necessarily like that were making like top 16 of regionals and stuff like that. Just like, and obviously it was a very low sample size of people using it. So that stood out to me as like, okay, this deck is obviously probably better than the results show because not a lot of people are playing it. I don't not a huge fan of the lists. I don't think they're consistent enough. Um, and they're still doing pretty solid. And then it also had the highest win rate on Play Limitless at the time. And at this point, I had my invite. I had given up on the top 16 North America chase. So a couple weeks before the event, I was like, Inteleon seems favored into basically every single deck in the format except for Lugia and Mew. And I don't think that Lugia and Mew are very good calls for the event. I knew that people would bring them, but I felt like they wouldn't stick around at the top tables because I didn't think they were very good meta calls. And that ended up being correct. There were definitely Lugia and Mew players, but as the deeper the run got, the less and less of them there were at the top tables with me. Um, so I honestly, because I didn't have huge expectations for the event, like I felt like I had a really good deck list and a really good meta call, but I didn't need points at the event. I was sort of happy to just play a risky deck. And I'd also, my mental health wasn't doing super great at the time. So I was really not wanting to like over prep for it and over stress. I locked in my list. I gave it to a couple of other people, Andrew Estrada and Callie Moore. I had a couple of suggestions came in, changed one or two cards, I think. And then I only actually played, I think the Thursday before the event, I played 3 games with the deck on PTCG Live, and then the next day I played one best of 3 with it in my Airbnb after I had gotten all the cards to borrow for it. And that was all of the games that I had on the deck going into the event.
Really, that's really interesting because obviously, when we see players just have such deep runs in events, sometimes we think that they've just been grinding this deck, preparing for so long. But then at the same time, you do just play a lot. You test a lot of different decks. You're a very creative deck builder, and sometimes just that raw skill is something that's able to carry you. Would you say that's correct, or would you say it a different way?
Yeah, I think that for sure is correct. I think it's also part of it. I've always said is like when you've been playing for a long time, so many decks that you play feel like other decks you've played before. So it's like I hadn't played that many games of Rapid Strike, but I've played so many similar decks with similar strategies over the course of my time playing Pokemon that it didn't feel that out of my element. I felt like I knew what I was supposed to be doing in every game. There's only I think one game across the entire tournament where I felt like I had made a mistake. Um, and that was in my round 9 of day 1 against Victor Ong when I think I benched an extra. I didn't play around Echoing Horn. I think I benched an extra one prizer not playing around Echoing Horn, and then he was able to take a VMAX knockout and 3-1 prizers thanks to Echoing Horn because of that. Um, and otherwise, I felt like I just knew how to play the deck, and it worked out for me. I think I've always like really liked playing spread decks. I cube from time to time. Whenever I cube, I always build something spread related and feel like I can pilot it pretty well right out the gate. So it's just always been sort of my forte. And yeah, I just think the longer that you play, the less sort of prep time you need with a specific deck. As long as you're playing Pokemon in general, you'll be better at playing Pokemon.
And you did kind of mention this, but you didn't necessarily tackle well at all for Mew with the deck, and it is a deck that on paper and had a pretty rough Mew matchup, and it was just a deck that you kind of chose to, not even try to play a Drapion because I was as you were talking about kind of the lists that had come before, I was like scrolling through the mid list looking at some lists, and they were playing one Drapion, two Drapion V Star even, and you just completely decided, I'm just not going to care about Mew. I'm just going to kind of let things go how they are. If I hit one, I might lose. Is that kind of a strategy you go into intentionally sometimes? Just saying, maybe there's one matchup I might lose really bad to, but I'm not going to go out of my way to prepare for it if it affects my consistency. Is that something you try to do intentionally?
Yeah, I'm definitely a consistency over tech kind of person. Um, I think that for even like after that event, I was still telling everybody not to tech for Mew. No matter how popular Mew was for the event, I just believed that it was not correct to tech for Mew as Inteleon. Um, because in my opinion, even with Spiritomb or with Double Drapion, you still are unfavored into Mew. And even the people that I know that did play like Double Drapion at a major with Inteleon still or Spiritomb. I know that Alex Schemanske and Josh Frank played Spiritomb in the deck at Worlds, I believe. And even they still admitted that the matchup was still unfavorable with those techs in it. So I was like, why am I even going to tech for it if I'm like most of the time going to lose to it anyways? I'd rather just be more consistent in all of my other games. And then like, there's still the chance that they just brick at that point. So it just didn't make sense to me to tech for a matchup when there was like no realistic way for me to tech for it and it actually turned the matchup into above a 50-50.
Hmm.
So I'd rather just be good against everything else. How I expected to not hit that many Mew over the course of the tournament. I was like, even if I hit like one, that's one loss. If I beat everything else, then one loss isn't a problem at all.
Yeah, exactly. Is there a kind of a point in your run where you started to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel and be like, oh, I could win this. I keep winning. I'm kind of in line to get top cut. I could take this whole thing home.
Yeah, so honestly, the 7-0 start like already felt like I was like, this feels great. My deck feels broken. I'm hearing that Mew and Lugia are not doing very well this weekend. Um, and I was already feeling pretty confident, but I think it was there was a point where I hit like an Arc Gudra game where in day 2 where the loser would be out, and Arc Gudra I think is probably even worse matchup for me than Arc Duraludon is, which I'd already hit 2 Arc Duraludon. No, I hit 3 Arc Duraludon in day 1. I went 2-1 against it, and I didn't really like that matchup either. So I hit this Arc Gudra, and I ended up um being able to knock out his one Gudra by like doing 70 damage to it twice with an Inteleon, and then surprising him with like a Hisuian Heavy Ball for my Urshifu double gunner or Echoing Horn double gunner to the bench, move the 20 to the active, 100 Furious Blows play because he thought my damage cap was going to be 80 or 70 with G-Max Spiral, and then I was able to turn it into 80 by powering up 100 Furious Blows in one turn, and that 10 damage was enough to knock out the Kujira. And I was like, at that point, I was like, this is my run. Like, I played out of my mind that game. I felt like no matter what I hit, I could figure it out. And then in my last couple of rounds, I ended up just hitting I ended up hitting Alex Schemanske with United Wings in round 14, and there's just no way that United Wings is ever beating Rapid Strike. And at that point, I just had one more game, and I felt like this was my run. Like I was like, this is like I'm destined to win this event. And then I hit Arctina in the next round, and someone I had already beaten in day one. Just won a very swift 2-0. And then looking at the top 8 bracket, the only deck that I really didn't want to hit was the single Lugia V-Star that made it in because of DQ. So I was pretty content. I figured the Lugia V-Star I wouldn't have to face until finals if I did hit it. And pretty much all smooth sailing in that top 8. So
How does it feel to kind of the way that they do finals for like the big international tournaments is that they get up to the finalists and then they give you the night to prepare and you play the next morning. How did it feel kind of that last Saturday night preparing to play against Ian Robb in the finals? Were you doing a lot of testing, or did you really just kind of have that confidence and we're just gonna see how it goes the next day?
So because I already played against Arctura Umbreon 3 times that weekend, including in round 1, I actually played against Raz Wolf, who was playing the exact same 60-card deck list as Ian Robb. So my first round of the tournament was actually the exact same 60-card deck list that I played against in finals of the tournament. And I didn't want to, I felt like I knew how to play the matchup. I wanted to just enjoy my night. And I ended up just going to a restaurant, and the night before the event was actually very hectic because I didn't plan to stay to Sunday night. And so we had to book an Airbnb at midnight, and then we showed up to the Airbnb and it was full of garbage and the lights were all on, and we were like, this seems like we should not stay here. We're probably gonna get mugged. So I ended up having to crash with someone. I think I managed to find a place to stay at about 2 a.m. And I didn't practice any. I knew the list. I studied the list to make sure that I knew exactly what his options were. But I tried to just relax as much as I could, especially with the hectic night. I just wanted to get a good night's sleep, wake up in the morning, do my sort of morning routine of, just I had a smoke and had an energy drink and felt pretty prepared for the event.
Yeah, and then as we know, kind of that finals, you got to, was it game 3 then that you kind of had that big
Yeah,
it was a turn 2 knockout or turn 1 knockout?
Yeah, it was a turn 2 knockout going first, and the prize cam ended at the start of my second turn. So by the time they were actually showing the game, I was using Rapid Strike Search to search my Tower of Waters to retreat into Urshifu for the knockout. So that was definitely the most crazy way I could have possibly had the finals end, I think.
Yeah, and yeah, it was pretty hype, and you really kind of helped put that archetype on the map. As you said, people had been playing it before, but after that, it was pretty definitive that it was a strong deck archetype, and a lot of people started playing it after that. If you don't mind me kind of asking a follow up on that, why is there a reason you didn't choose to play it at Worlds?
So I found that the Palkia list from the Palkia list that I played is I think about 4 or 5 cards off of Anthony Perez's top 52 list for NAIC. I found that deck and I was just kind of this deck seems favored into everything. Inteleon felt favored into everything except Mew and Lugia. But the Palkia list was favored into Inteleon if you played the Articuno, and then it was sort of favored into everything. It was also favored into Mew, very heavily. And I expected Mew to be a lot more popular at Worlds, which it did end up being, obviously, with 2 spots in top 8 and coming first, with Azul's whole group bringing it to day 2. So I did make a correct meta call there. I also didn't expect that much Lugia, which ended up being incorrect for day one. The Lugia ended up being the most popular deck, but I only hit one and was able to um, beat almost everything else. I went 6-2 in day one and then 6-2 again in day two. Um, so it was more of just like looking at the matchups. I didn't think that there was too much reason to play Inteleon over Palkia because Palkia just had favorable matchups into all the same things that Inteleon did, but it also was favored into Mew. So um, just felt like the most strong deck for the event. Also, people wouldn't have any testing time against it. Really, I didn't think anybody was dedicating their testing to testing against like this rogue Palkia deck that made top 32 at NAIC. So there's always a huge advantage of at Worlds to playing a rogue deck because when you're like almost equally skilled with most of your opponents, one of the only ways that you can get an advantage is by having more practice in the matchup than your opponent does. And obviously, if you play a rogue deck, you're gonna have way more practice against your opponent's deck than your opponent has against you. So
Hmm. Is that something that you recommend more for the World Championship, or is that just a piece of advice that you see in general? Like, I feel like there's, or obviously arguments for just playing the best deck as best as you can, and arguments for playing more unorthodox picks. What situations lead you to go for one over the other?
yeah, so I think that in general, it definitely. I think that if there is a good rogue deck, honestly, for any tournament, I think that if there is a good rogue deck, it is usually optimal to play it. But sometimes, there isn't always a good rogue deck. There isn't always a off meta deck that can actually keep up with what is in the meta. You're always going to have an advantage if you know the lines in the matchup better than your opponent does. Um, so you're always going to get that with a rogue deck, but some events there just isn't a secret deck that you can play to the event. Even right now, like I could be wrong, someone might bring something crazy, but personally I don't really think that there are any super niche decks that are gonna like break out for Worlds. I think that everybody sort of has a general idea of all of the decks that are solid. Um, so for Worlds this year, I maybe wouldn't recommend just playing something crazy off kilter, but generally speaking, um, I think that like playing a rogue deck, if you can like build a good rogue deck that you think is good into the meta, is definitely always like a solid choice, just because your opponents aren't prepared to play against it.
Hmm. Yeah, I do think that maybe this past NAIC that deck might have been Reggie Drago, but now everyone knows that it's kind of a top
Yeah,
threat and everyone's testing against it the month leading up
yeah,
to
especially with
Worlds.
the improvements from Shrouded Fable. I think that at least like I know that there are some more casual players that I've talked to that you know aren't as hype on it, but I think that from most of the like people that I've talked to that are going to Worlds, it is very much on everybody's radar that like especially with the Kiram Cologne combo now, Greg Drago is going to be a huge threat for Worlds, and I think that would probably if it hadn't done okay at NAIC, maybe would have been something that could have been kept under the radar for Worlds, but
Then leading into kind of this past season, how did you approach this past the 22, 23, 24 season after the success you had been coming off of with NAIC and Worlds? What was the kind of the plan you had for yourself for this season, the goals you had set, and do you have any reflections on how this past season went for you?
yeah. So my goal was just to really do as well as I could at every event that I went to. Um, I think that I had the opportunity to play at the most events that I ever have this season. Um, and I think that reflecting back on it, I think that I do not like attending that many events. I feel like I don't have, if I attend an event every month, I just don't feel like I have an appropriate amount of prep time to really like build something unorthodox. And that is the way I like to play the game. I like to put a lot of time into something and figure out exactly what the best deck is for the event. Whereas I think when you're attending events that frequently, it's usually going to be more correct to just play, one of the best decks because you don't have as much time to make sure that your lists for if you're playing like a more rogue deck, you don't have as much time to make sure that the list is as good as you need it to be. Um, and so I honestly wasn't very happy with the way my past season went. I got a few day twos, but I sort of was going into it like, okay, I'm just gonna play events. I know I'm gonna get my invite most likely. I went to like very few locals, and then I ended up getting points at every single tournament that I attended, except for NAIC because I scooped my last round so my opponent could get points. Um, but I really did not feel like I had the season that I wanted. I think that sort of burnout and just my mental health was not in a great state all season. I think that that goes a long way to any player's success in a season is, how you're feeling with the game, about the game, how you're engaging with the game. I'm definitely reflecting back on it and trying to learn from it and going into next season. I won't be able to play as many events next season anyways. I pretty much won't be playing at all quarter 1 because my partner is having a baby in October and I'll be busy raising the new member of my family.
Oh,
But
congratulations.
I'll play a little bit more in the mid to later season. I do have a few events planned, and my plan is really just to still just to do as well as I can at every event, and really put more prep time at home into all of the events that I can attend, rather than worrying about this grind, worrying about trying to go to a bunch of tournaments. I think it really I do succeed more when I'm just connecting with the game, when I'm just enjoying playing Pokemon. More so than when I'm focused on, trying to replicate my previous success.
Hmm. And is that maybe advice you'd kind of offer any player in general when it comes to succeeding? And then on top of that, do you see any maybe differences in how you or other players might want to approach the game with the way that the point structure is changing this upcoming season?
Yeah, so I think that just setting more reasonable goals for yourself. Like I think that even for this season, where it's going to be, harder, almost like one of the hardest seasons ever to qualify for Worlds. Um, I think that even before that, like a lot of players set their eyes on Worlds as the only goal, and then if you don't get it, it destroys your relationship with the game, and the whole time leading up to it, it can sort of destroy your relationship with the game because you are putting so much more pressure on yourself to just like scrape by with the minimum amount of points at events that you need. And I think that it really is important that you are enjoying playing Pokemon. I think you're not gonna have the success that you want unless you are enjoying playing the game. So I think that if you're not, you really need to just take a step back and maybe take a break and reevaluate. Um, but my advice for this season is to set your goal on just doing better than you have in the past. And that's sort of my goal for any season is you should don't set your bar way higher than you ever have achieved before. Just set your bar at doing better than you have previously. And I know that advice might come off a little hollow to as someone who has gone their invite for consecutive years, especially for newer players. But I was only allowed to attend a few events a year for most of my time playing, and my goal was always just to do the best that I could, play the best that I could. Um, when you sit down at just try to sit down at a table, play the best Pokemon you can, and learn from any mistakes that you make. And I think that approaching the game sort of one game at a time that way um, is sort of the healthiest way to learn and grow.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely a lot of very helpful advice for a lot of players, especially ones that are looking to improve. That might feel a little demoralized with the difficulty that the worlds might pose this upcoming year. Just take it one event at a time, and just focus on growth as opposed to having worlds as that number one only goal.
Yeah, there are players who there might be players that top eight multiple 2+ regionals this season and don't get their invite, and that sucks. That's tough. I think someone who top eights 2 regionals in a season definitely deserves to go to Worlds, but in my opinion, however, um, I don't think that I think that setting the goal as Worlds, makes those two top eight finishes maybe feel a little tougher. I mean, even for me, the season where I broke out in top four Dallas and then decided to go for my invite after that. When I did miss my invite by 50 or so points, it really soured that finish. I was like, all right, top four to regional this year, I still didn't get my invite. And when really I should just be looking back at it as I top four to regional this year, or in this season, if you top eight 2 regionals, that's an incredible accomplishment. If you top eight a regional, top 16 regional, and top 32 regional, that's still a crazy accomplishment, whether or not you make worlds. So I think people just really need to sink in how good of a player they are based on their accomplishments. You don't need to go to worlds to be a good player. to prove that you're a good player to yourself.
Hmm.
And I think that really like looking at what you've accomplished in the game and going, yeah, I'm pretty good at this game is important rather than just like putting it all on that world's metric to determine whether or not you see yourself as a world's caliber player.
Now, one other thing I do want to ask is that aside from playing and, as you also said, kind of organizing and judging and things like that, something you've really gotten involved in over the past year is writing a lot of articles, whether it's for the Shuffle Squad, on Metafy, for Alex Schemansche's site. That's become kind of a big part of your presence in the community. When did that become more of a thing that you wanted to become involved in, and has that been something that's really made you um, kind of change your relationship with being part of the game outside of just being there as a player?
So only in the last couple years have I been able to more consistently write articles, with compensation and do it more consistently. But I've actually been writing. I've always like loved writing in general. There was a point at which I wanted to become an English teacher, and even like when I was in high school and not competing that much. My Since my first season of Masters, I've written like tournament reports and stuff like that. All of my finishes. I would just publish them on my own like Wix site back then. Um, and it's sort of just always been something that I've loved to do is share my knowledge of the game. And sometimes I feel like um, I like to make videos and stuff like that from time to time. I've enjoyed it when I've done it. I like to stream from time to time, but I have some maybe confidence issues in like my on-screen presence. And writing has just always been like a very smooth outlet for me. I'm even like um, back in like 20 or whenever Lost Thunder released, I think like 2018, 19, I released like a six articles in a month that were it was like 50 deck lists for the Lost Thunder format. And I got a lot of flack because nobody knew who I was at that point. I was just like some teenager with no results posting like six articles on decks from the Lost Thunder format on Facebook. And um, but I didn't really care. I just had fun writing the articles. It's just always something I've loved doing. I put a lot of time into the game, and especially when I am putting more time into the game, I just love sharing all of my ideas and thoughts with other players, especially because I feel like I have a lot of original and unique ideas to share with people.
Yeah, I think you kind of answered the question I was about to ask, which is like, do you find writing like to be a good outlet for kind of your more unorthodox ideas outside of just testing them in game?
Yeah, I really like to share. Like when I do, every time I write an article, like sometimes I'll write like a guide on like a more popular deck, or um, I'll write guides on like, oh, my suggestions for the current format. I'll just give like my top lists for the current format. But I really do always try to find something that is unexplored. Even if it's a popular deck, I try to pick a deck that I have a more unorthodox list for to share with people that I think is good. Um, I always try to like bring original ideas to my content, and it's really, especially when um, I don't have an event in that format. Maybe that format's done for me, and I have this really cool list to share that I didn't really get the chance to play a bunch of. It's a nice way for me to share that idea with people, and I love seeing when people take those less orthodox lists and I do well with them. I see from time to time people pilot lists for my articles. To either like day 2 finishes or League Cup wins, and it's always really exciting seeing those ideas that I couldn't maybe um, bring to events myself, piloted by other people, and prove that was merit to that testing that I did on those more unorthodox ideas.
Is there maybe kind of any advice you'd give players who are looking to kind of follow in your footsteps and build more unorthodox decks? Because I think a lot of players, especially maybe when they're getting into the game, might be looking at archetypes that aren't being explored and messing around with them, but they might not always necessarily have the vision or like the card knowledge or the deck knowledge to build it effectively. What would you recommend for players who are looking to get creative, build things that other players might think is bad but they think might be good, but do it in a way that can allow them to have some real success with it?
I think right now the amount of online resources that we have, the best way to try your ideas really is to play in the like online tournaments or just like grind ladder games. And I think that the number one mistake people make when building rogue decks is in the consistency department. People over tech for matchups, um, or just because they're building a deck basically from scratch, they don't have an engine to work off of. Um, and I think that I mean I even fall prey myself sometimes to under testing a deck, and then it ends up being way less consistent than I thought it would be. Um, so I think that like the number one thing when you're building a road deck is consistency, especially against whatever the most popular deck in format is. I will grind like that is the thing I will do most when I build a new road deck is like grind like 30 to 50 games against the most popular deck in the format. How many times do I lose because I bricked? And how many times do I draw fine and still lose just because maybe the matchup isn't as good as I had hoped it would be? Um, and really, I think that like there's like some sunk cost fallacy when people build rogue decks too, of like, oh, I put all this time into the deck. Now I'm sort of discovering that it's not that consistent, or maybe doesn't have as good of a matchups. And I think you have to be prepared to not always lock in on the unorthodox choice, and be prepared to always have a backup is what I do. I always have, if this deck doesn't work out, if I've put too much time into this deck and it turns out not to be good, I always have a safe play, and usually that is the best deck in the format is typically what I tend to go for if I'm could not figure out something better.
That's very helpful, and I think a lot of people could learn a lot from that. Um, Cyrus, as we start wrapping up, is there any events you're planning to be at? I'm assuming you're going to be at Worlds, but you said quarter 1 might be a little bit slower for you. Do you have any shout outs, and where can people get in touch with you?
So you can find me on pretty much all socials at Cyrus Davis TCG. Same with on Metafy at Cyrus Davis. If you're looking for coaching, you can also find me writing articles on the Shuffle Squad Patreon, my sponsor, and on Schemanski's Corner on Substack. Um, Events that I'll be at upcoming, obviously Worlds, and then I will pretty much almost definitely be at Toronto Regionals quarter 1. And then after that, I will keep up to date, letting people know what events that I'll be attending once we have more events announced for quarters 2, 3, 4 next year. But for now, that'll be it. And yeah, my only shout out is to the Shuffle Squad, my sponsor. Fantastic team, fantastic group of people to work with.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cyrus. I really appreciate you speaking with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a great time.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to Cyrus for being so generous with their time. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one, please consider giving the podcast a follow, review, or rating wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on social media, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at memcappodcast. Or if you want to see posts about my own TCG experiences, you can follow me on Twitter at RZGladys. Hope you have a great day, and thank you for listening.